So one has to be careful in dealing with the Russians, but their capacity to, they have neither the will nor really the ability to threaten the United States. And I think that, it's important to recognize that. As, the Bush administration, apparently, there's a book out that claims that in the midst of the Georgia War, two years ago in August, that it came up to the cabinet as to whether or not the U.S. should intervene in that conflict and basically bombard the tunnels through which the Russians were sending troops. Now, I read that and thought, we went 50 years in a Cold War without getting into a conflict with the Soviet Union. And somebody suggested we should start shooting at the Russians over a conflict on their border with a country that used to be part of both the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. Now, this is a nuclear-armed power. It is one thing to shoot at the Serbs and the Iraqis, who we can take out pretty easily. It's quite another thing to shoot at people who have nuclear weapons, and shoot at them on their border in areas that they view as vital. And I tell people, imagine if we had a conflict with Mexico and the Russians showed up to back the Mexicans. We would not take that kindly. So one wants to be careful about these things, but they have no capacity to attack us. So that's not a good substitute. Then there's China. Now, China is the new kind of potential emerging threat. A lot of people view it seriously. If you read articles about Chinese military spending, the Pentagon puts out a report that put out one earlier this year. Estimates of Chinese military spending, it's hard to know. They kind of play games on the numbers and currency changes and all this stuff is hard. Our estimates, the Pentagon figures maybe around 150 billion equivalent. Now, if you think about what China's trying to do, we spend 700, the Chinese spend 150. They ain't overtaking us. And one other thing, just one comparison, you read the report and there's concern the Chinese might be trying to build an aircraft carrier. Now, the U.S. currently has 11 carrier groups. The Chinese have none. Now, the Chinese are not going to build one and sail it towards Pearl Harbor. It ain't going to happen. If you look around the world, there are currently really 11 aircraft carriers on Earth, or 15. We have 11. The Brits have 2. Well, they're our friends and allies. The Indians have 1. They're not terribly happy with the Chinese. There's a tense relationship between India and China for a number of reasons. And the Russians have 1. And the Russians aren't going to go to the aid of the Chinese. When you think about the military, China remains dramatically behind. What China is doing is building a deterrent capability. China is building up its nuclear weapons to make sure that we can't coerce them. China is building up asymmetric warfare capabilities in terms of information war to take out our satellites. And China is building missiles and subs to be able to sink our carriers. They don't need 11 carrier groups if they can sink ours. Because what you imagine is 20 years from now, a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, and the Navy comes into the president and says, we could send the 7th Fleet there, but of course, the Chinese might sink it. Well, the president's going to think pretty hard before he puts that multi-billion-dollar ship with 5,000 personnel on board, plus all the surrounding ships, into a war zone and loses it. Now, the problem is it's relatively easy to deter. It's very expensive to overcome. So how do you overcome that? We have to spend a lot more. China doesn't have to spend a lot to deter. That's what China's doing. China is not building a capacity to attack us aggressively. China is trying to create a capacity to prevent us from attacking them. Now, we might prefer a world in which we dominate every region, but we have to recognize what the cost of that will be and ask whether or not we can afford that. And there are very different issues to say, can we still force our way into East Asia versus defend America? China is not threatening America. Second question is, well, how about a policy of preemption? The whole Iraq War, I think, kind of muddled what preemption and preventive war are. Virtually everybody agrees with preemption. Preemption is, you see the Japanese, aircraft carriers showing up outside of Pearl Harbor and you blow them up before they set their planes off. That's preemption. Wars come in, you strike before they strike. Preventive war is you look ahead and say, we're worried about these people 5 years from now, 10 years from now, who knows? We're going to blow them up today. Now, the problem with preventive war is it assumes all sorts of things. It assumes you can look into the future, that you have any idea of capabilities and intent. And it's very, the likelihood of doing that well is very hard. And I'm always astounded by people who tell me on domestic policy the federal government is a mess. It's a disaster. It does bad things. But then tell me internationally, oh yeah, we can all figure this out. We know how to fix other societies. We can look ahead and know what these other countries are doing. It's the same federal government. It's the same kind of political processes at work. It's the same set of incentives, all the inefficiencies. And if you're going to war, you want to be really, really careful. We considered preventing war before. In the mid-1960s, there was a lot of talk about going after China. China was building nuclear weapons. National Review magazine was writing about this. The Johnson administration considered it. And we had the capacity. We could have gone in and blown up nuclear facilities. The question is, what would the world have looked like today? It's hard to know. It's counterfactual. Nevertheless, my guess is that the China that would have emerged would not be one that's dramatically changed today, where kind of crazy Maoism is gone. One that's independent of the Russians and the older Soviet Union. It likely would have created a China that would have been more closely aligned with the Russians. It probably would have created a much more radicalized political environment within China. Probably would have ensured a China today that would have enduring enmity with the United States. Any number of things. My guess is we did the right thing not going to war then. But that's the problem with preventing war. You're trying to look ahead and try to figure out the future when you don't know. So I think we want to be very, very cautious, the thought of running off to war. And I think Iraq is a very good example of that. Now, I was struck by people who could recognize that we had successfully deterred Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin, two of the greatest mass murderers in human history. And Stalin had a large nuclear arsenal. We could deter both of them, but people who were running around afraid of the Iraqis. Astounding to me. This place was a wreck. And Saddam Hussein is an evil guy, but the same thing I say about Kim Jong-il is that he wanted his virgins in this life, not the next. I mean, these are not suicidal people. Hey, they want to live. And the nice thing about nation states is they have a return address. If they're dumb enough to start something, you can wipe them out. Kim Jong-il in North Korea, the same way, nasty guy. But this guy's trying to build a transition so his 28-year-old son can become great leader or dear leader or whatever. No, he's known as brilliant comrade. I love the titles in North Korea. But he's trying to build this dynasty. He wants the future to go on. So my view, Iraq was, I'm skeptical of claims that they're making these things, but even if they are, come on. Why war? And what we found is, the problem of war is you get all these unexpected consequences. This is going to be a cakewalk. No problem. Right? It's going to be wonderful. I mean, some of the talk at the time was, now that we're done with Iraq, we should go on to Syria and Iran. Well, let's take everybody. The arrogance and the hubris, I think, it shows the danger. An administration that believed, what it could do, it had, basically, I think, an ideological belief in terms of the outcome, and we are still dealing with those consequences. The most important outcome, I would argue, of the Iraq War is we strengthened Iran. We took away the most important counterweight to Iran. We've given the Iranians extraordinary influence within Iraq. And this presumably is not what we wanted to do. Because today in the Middle East, the greatest worry for us is Iran. But what we managed to do with the war in Iraq is actually strengthen the power today we are most concerned about. So, kind of planning on running around the world doing preemptive and preventing wars and stuff is probably not a good idea. And then there's terrorism. Now, terrorism remains probably the most important security challenge that we face. But unfortunately, armored divisions and carrier groups and air wings don't help us very much when it comes to terrorism. Terrorism is far more likely to be dealt with by better intelligence, with cooperation with other governments, it's using special forces. It's a whole host of things. We've done very well rolling up Al-Qaeda. Now, we've got a problem in a lot of places where you've got homegrown groups. The people that did the Bali bombing and bombing in Madrid and bombing in London, these are not Al-Qaeda international activists. These are local folks who may have taken inspiration but are kind of operating on their own. But the problem with terrorism is, that going to war, creating this kind of massive, interventionist policy, as I argued earlier, is, I think, likely to give us more problems rather than less. It's going to create more enemies rather than fewer. I think Afghanistan is a very good example. I spent 10 days in Afghanistan back in May. Now, this place is a catastrophe. Now, the tragedy here is, it's not like Afghanistan is inherently going to suffer war. I mean, there are a lot of Afghans who want peace. Indeed, much of the 20th century, under the king, Afghanistan was peaceful. I mean, it's always ruled by a light hand from Kabul. I mean, they've never had a strong central government. But this is a place, Kabul was reasonably international. It had none of the crazy kind of, Islamic stuff going on in terms of dress and what have you. Out in the countryside, very rural, very traditional, but relatively peaceful.